Welcome back to Myths, Legends, and Truths. And the topic for today are changelings. If you've heard our fairy podcast before, this will sound pretty familiar. But before we get to the story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. In Ireland, they believed in fairies, but not the sweet and cute fairies you may be thinking about. They believed they were evil. It was believed that mushrooms growing in a circle were portals for changelings to come through in search of human victims. The mushroom circles are called fairy rings and cause alarm when seen. As for the changelings, they are shapeshifters that can morph to look like their victim. Once the changelings take their target's place, the victim is then kidnapped and imprisoned in the fairy realm. Women and children were commonly targeted because they are believed to be vulnerable. If a woman or child got sick, became ill-tempered, showed lack of interest, or was difficult to engage, it was often believed that a changeling had taken its place. It was very important to get rid of the creature in order to get their loved one back from the fairy realm. Once it was confirmed that a person was taken from the human realm, their loved ones only had 9 days to rescue them. If not, they would be lost forever. Aside from illness or behavioral changes, another way to confirm the person was a changeling was by holding iron close and trying to touch them with it. If the person flinched or tried to get away from it, then that was a sure sign that it was an imposter. Also, if a person began to seize, then that was also confirmation that it was not human. The way to banish these shapeshifters was to make them as uncomfortable as possible so that they would want to leave and return their prisoner. Such tactics included holding the changeling over fire, making them eat feces, force them to drink urine, burn them, or using foxglove, aka digitalis, which is a heart medication, and it's still used today. First, they would bathe the person in foxglove, and if that failed, then the person would be forced to drink it, which could be fatal. Basically, the person would be tortured, and as you could imagine, very few survived these tactics. It was also believed that during the time of an abduction, the fairies would try to distract loved ones from trying to save the changeling's victim by causing the death of another loved one. In Ireland's famous 19th century case of Bridget Cleary, her husband's father passed away days after her believed abduction into the fairy world. Bridget Cleary was a successful dressmaker in Ireland, which also sold eggs laid by her chicken. An independent or working woman was a dangerous notion, especially in her village at that time. She was married to Michael Cleary. Her father was a retired laborer, and because of him, Bridget and her husband were able to live in an upscale cottage with her father in the village since it was a laborer's cottage. It was a beautiful place to live, but it was odd that no one wanted to live there. The cottage was located close to fairy rings, the portal to the fairy realm. Bridget's mother, who was a known believer of the fairies, had recently passed. Bridget was frequently seen visiting the fairy rings during her deliveries. One day, Bridget returned to her home and was complaining of a headache and could not get warm, with her condition worsening as days passed. Other stories say that she returned with a cough and confusion. Although she was diagnosed with bronchitis by a doctor, her husband was convinced that she had been abducted by fairies, and a changeling returned to the home in her place. He convinced her father and his self-proclaimed fairy expert cousin confirmed that the creature in the home was an imposter. They forcibly held her down against her will and attempted to feed her a concoction made by a sort of fairy medicine man that would get rid of the creature. The next day, her husband was not convinced that his wife was back. In a fit of anger, he threw her to the floor, knocking her unconscious, and burned her in front of her father and 2 others. After burning her, he buried her in a shallow grave. Michael Cleary was tried for her murder during a trial called the Fairy Trial. To this day, you may hear a child's jump rope rhyme that goes, "Are you a witch? Are you a fairy? Or are you the wife of Michael Cleary?" being recited in Ireland's schoolyards today. Was Bridget in fact abducted by fairies? Or was her husband unable to conform to a changing society and accept having a strong, hardworking, and independent wife? Or was he unknowingly suffering from Capgras syndrome, which is the delusional belief that a person has been replaced by an imposter? It is a rare psychological disorder which was used by an attorney to defend his client during a murder trial. On June 2nd, 2009, in Ithaca, New York, 28-year-old cancer researcher Carolyn Coffey and her husband, 24-year-old Blage Cott, were out for a jog. They had just recently returned from their honeymoon. At some point, Blage was overcome with the feeling that the woman next to him was an imposter, and her only mission was to destroy him. He felt the need to defend himself and slit her throat. He was found guilty by the jury and sentenced to life in jail. Was this rare disorder, coupled with gullible and/or uneducated people, the fuel that helped spread the belief of changelings, which led to torture and countless murders? Or are fairies and changelings real, and Capgras syndrome is just a label for something that cannot be explained? Regardless of your answer and beliefs, one question remains in my mind. How far would you go for your beliefs?